My name is Gaby Michaca. I'm Mexican and Spanish is my first language. For my background, I'm a school neuropsychologist trained on the medical model and then switched to become a transdisciplinary therapist after I became an OT. Sometimes people ask me, why do you have so much passion for autism? Well, I'm the daughter of an autistic woman who didn't have the supports needed, and I had to navigate with her through many therapies and interventions. For that reason, I want to start with a question. What happens when the evidence we are trained to use does not fully fit the reality we are working in? In this presentation, I will share how working in Los Cabos has challenged the way I understand assessment and intervention, and how this has led me to rethink what it means to build a neuroaffirmative approach in context. In Los Cabos private practice, we are not identifying autism when it begins. We are identifying it when it becomes visible and challenging for the system. Our clinical data shows that only about 8% of children are evaluated before age 3, while most are identified between ages 3 and 9. That means through the school years. What is important here is that early characteristics are already present, but it is not acted upon. We live in a pyramidal medical system where the expert has to acknowledge the parental concerns to get access to services. So the issue is not detection tools, it is timing and system. By the time children arrive to our services, they are not presenting with isolated needs. They come with layered, complex profiles, communication differences, sensory needs, emotional regulation challenges, and relational mismatches, all interacting at the same time. This tells us something critical. We are not seeing early autism. We are seeing accumulated complexity in human differences with many adverse experiences. And complexity is not a problem, it is the consequence of late identification, social and cultural demands, with lack of support. One finding that deeply changed how I think about intervention was that more than 70% of the families in our local data set reported a family history of neurodivergence or autistic traits. This means, in many cases, we are not only working with the autistic children, we are working with a neurodivergent family system. And yet, most autism services continue to focus almost exclusively on the child, without considering what it means for autistic or neurodivergent parents to raise autistic children in a world with very limited lifespan supports. Many parents are navigating sensory overwhelm, emotional exhaustion, stigma, and systematic barriers while simultaneously trying to advocate for their children. So, when we talk about parent mediated interventions or family participations, we also need to ask what supports do parents themselves need? How do we reduce the pressure placed on families within systems that were not designed for neurodivergent ways of being? For me, this shift intervention from a child centered model to a relational and intergenerational perspective. This is not simply a clinical issue, this is a system and context mismatch. In Cabo, access to services is limited and often private. Screening is not systematic. It depends on parental concerns and families navigating through multiple cultural and linguistic realities. So, what we see is a system that reacts when difficulties become visible instead of supporting early identification. In Mexico, we often describe ourselves as malinchistas. We use evidence based practice without questioning, meaning that knowledge coming from outside, especially from the US or Europe, is often adopted as the standard. This is not about rejecting that knowledge. It is about recognizing that translation alone is not adaptation. So, what we see is not just a service gap, it is also an epistemological gap between where knowledge is produced and where it is applied. If context shapes the problem, it also shapes what works. In Cabo, access to services is not equal. Cultural expectations are different and shape the meaning of what is socially accepted. And language shapes interaction. So these are not neutral variables. They actively shape how children are identified, how families understand development, and how interventions are implemented. So when we ask what works, we cannot answer that without asking for whom, for the child or for the system. Where? For home, school, clinic, or in the community? And under what conditions? That means cultural and language family differences. This means that evidence based practice are not universal solutions. They are starting points that must be interpreted through context. So, if context shape practice, then the question becomes how do we adapt practice in a meaningful way? If practice cannot be imported, then it must be co-constructed. This means moving away from the idea that intervention is something we deliver toward understanding that it is something we build in relationship with families, with children, and with their context. Families are not just recipients of services, they are knowledge holders with their cultural and lived realities. We need to switch our mindset of children as active agents. We need to put their voices and intentions first, even when we judge them as not intentional. We need to co construct the experience with them. And as therapists, this requires a shift in our role. We need to understand ourselves first, identify our own biases, acknowledge the double empathy problem, and switch from an expert to a participant, where we actively listen to understand differences, identify tensions, and walk through the middle pathway. Then we adapt and we build together what support actually looks like in that specific context. If we accept that practice must be contextual and co-constructed, then we need a different way to think about intervention. This is the model I am proposing. Instead of starting with protocols, we start with questions. Who are we as professionals within this system? Acknowledging our Abla's language, culture, and system. What are the needs of the child and the family in this context? Releasing the tensions between them and following their interests and their needs. What supports are actually meaningful for them? Always ask if this is a real support for their occupation. And what resources do we realistically have? Time, money, and effort. Only after that do we ask, how do we adapt evidence based practice to fit this reality. This shifts practice from applying interventions to building them through an iterative, relational, and context responsive process. I want to round this in what we actually see in Cabo. A typical case is a child referred around age 5 or 6, usually because of school concerns, communication needs, behavior challenges in social participation, or learning needs. But when we assess them, we don't find a single issue. We see a complex profile: language differences, sensory needs, emotional regulation challenges, and relational difficulties. And when we look back, many of those children had early signs, sometimes even risk factors during pregnancy or family history, but they were not identified or supported early on. So the question is not just how to intervene, but how we could have understood and supported this child differently from the beginning. This is not an individual delay, it is a system delay. So, what does this mean for our daily practice? First, we need to shift where we start with a context, not with protocols. Second, intervention needs to be co constructed with families and grounded in their lived realities. This also means we don't abandon evidence based practice, but we stop applying them blindly. We adapt them intentionally. And finally, we need to rethink our goals. Instead of focusing on normalization, we focus on participation, on what allows the child and the family to engage meaningfully in their everyday life. This leads to one final idea. I want to close with this idea. Neuroaffirmative practice is not something we apply, it is something we build together. It is built through understanding context, through relationships with families and communities, and through focus on meaningful participation. In a place like Cabo, this means we cannot simply import models and expect them to work. We need to ask, who are we? What do we need? And what is possible here? Only then can evidence-based practice become truly relevant, ethical, and responsive? And that for me is what it means to move toward a neuroaffirmative approach. We don't need better protocols. We need a better understanding of ourselves and the system we live in. Thank you. References.